addressing the theme of hope, but there are many people that are facing fairly desperate situations. So I'd like to ask the question, how do you face loss when you lose something, when you lose everything? What do you do when everything goes wrong? Do you find yourself asking, why? Or why me? There's a brilliant story in the scriptures about a guy very wealthy who lost everything. And what we'll be looking at with this story is the fact that not even the greatest riches can prevent trouble from coming to you. The best advisors and the best advice are sometimes totally inadequate. And we also see here in this story a major exception to the rule of cause and effect. In other words, you get what you deserve. And that's mostly true, but not always. And it also addresses the question, why? So I meet Job. Job is the Bill Gates of the ancient world. Not only was he very wealthy, but he was totally clean of corruption. It says that he feared God and he turned away from evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. Now that sounds very antiquated and otherworldly, but let me just unpack what that means. 7,000 sheep, what does that mean? To look after 7,000 sheep, you're going to need quite a few shepherds. How many sheep would a typical shepherd look after? Well, in the ancient world, and even in today's world, in the Middle East, a flock of 100 is a big flock. So let's say they all had the biggest flock. 7,000 sheep, that requires 70 shepherds. What about 3,000 camels? What are camels used for? Well, we know they cross the desert, but what do they cross the desert for? These are for international trade. This is the equivalent of 3,000 shipping containers. What about yoke of oxen? Well, just imagine 2 bullocks yoked together with a big bar across their necks and a yoke around it, each one. And that bar is attached to a plow or something heavy. That yoke of oxen, that pair of oxen, is the equivalent of a tractor. So Job had 500 tractors. And you don't just leave those parked in the field, do you? You put them to work. He's got a lot of land to do with. What about the 500 female donkeys? You go again to the Middle East today and you'll see what they do with donkeys. They load these poor critters right up. These are the delivery vans around the local markets. So what we're looking at here is a glimpse behind the curtain. And when we see the first chapter, the beginning of the story, it talks about a heavenly council. And it talks about all of these different representatives coming to present themselves to God. And God says, "Where have you come from, Satan?" And he says, "I have been going up and down on the earth, walking up and down on it," which is an ancient way of saying, I own the place. And we see in this little brief scenario that the powers of evil have no rights, no power over the human race unless we give it to them. Well, the story goes on that tragedy strikes Job because it becomes a bit of a showcase between good and evil here. And the oxen and the donkeys are stolen by a Sabaean raiding party. This is a tribal group. And then somebody sends the message to Job, look what's just happened. And while the messenger is giving this bad news, someone else comes along and says, actually all of your sheep have been destroyed by a vicious electrical storm, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And no sooner had he said that than another messenger comes along and he says, all the camels were stolen by 3 raiding parties of Chaldeans, another tribal group that came in from the east. And again, no sooner had that messenger given the bad message, another one comes in and says, all your children were killed. They were having a party together in one of their houses. A fierce windstorm came along, blew the house down and killed them all. Only I have escaped. Poor old Job. He said, well, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So it's pretty amazing that this guy retained his faith despite losing everything. Then there's a repetition. There's another heavenly council, and Satan comes along and says, well, you know, I'm still walking up and down the earth. I still own it. And God says, what about Job? And it's interesting that Satan says, anybody can lose all that they have, but if he loses his own life, then he would complain. Well, God says, well, you can touch him, but don't kill him. And so he was covered with boils from head to foot. And because of that, any ancient skin condition like that in the ancient world, they had to go outside the city gates and sit down, and Job did that. He sat down in the ash heap where people emptied out the ashes from their kitchen fires. And he sat there. And 3 of his friends came and joined him. And they were there for a week, saying nothing. They tore their clothes and they just sat down in the dust with him. Now, while they were quiet, they were the best kind of friends. But as soon as they opened their mouths to give advice, that's when they were the worst friends. I think the main thing we can learn from this is that if you've got a friend that is suffering some incredible tragedy, they don't need your advice. They don't need what you're going to say to them. You don't have to think of something to say to help them. Your presence will help them, not you being there will help them, not the words that you say. So be quiet, just be there for them. Well, anyway, 3 friends came, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They've all got roots in other Bible characters in the scriptures. Eliphaz was from the line of Esau. Bildad was from the line of Abraham, and Zophar had some connection with one of the Jewish tribes as well. Eliphaz is obviously the senior partner because he starts first, and that was what the culture was. The younger ones had to take a back seat, let the older ones speak first. He starts off very politely, draws on his own religious experience, which was a bit freaky, and he challenges Job to just accept God's discipline. He's obviously punishing you. You've obviously done something wrong. So just accept it. The next friend, Bildad, he considers that the gap between God and his people is just too great. So it's interesting that Bildad says something that is so wrong and so preposterous that Job angrily interrupts him. Zophar, well, he just simply says, Job, you don't know what you're talking about. It's interesting how these 3 friends who are distant from the tragedy know all about the tragedy and are telling Job how to react to it. Well, Job, because he's innocent, and he argues for the majority of the book, chapter after chapter, showing his innocence. And so the 3 friends stopped talking. And in the ancient world, if the accusers stopped talking, that means that the accused is innocent. If Job had a case to answer to, that case has just been washed out. Well, those 3 men finish, and there's a young man at the side, Elihu. Young, inexperienced, and angry. Because this young man hasn't experienced much of life, he knows everything about life. You know what I'm talking about. And he comes in disgusted by the incompetence of these old men. He is stirred to intense anger by the failure of these 3 wise men to convince Job of his error. And he starts off very cautiously because he's deeply aware that these 3 men are all senior to him, and he knows his place among these senior men. But once he gets warmed up, he goes for it. It's just verbal diarrhea. He speaks 3 times longer than any of the others, thinking that he's got something new and fresh and relevant to offer. But he just covers the same old ground using perhaps more modern language. So it's a bit of a waste of time. And then God enters the scene. He speaks from a whirlwind. And it's interesting where you see the whirlwind in Scripture, but often it is when God speaks in judgment. When God replies to Job, there are many amazing things that he says, but he starts off by simply talking about creation. The cycles, the seasons, the order of the universe, the life patterns of animals and birds, and then he talks about a couple of creatures that maybe are mythical. In other words, God cares for things that we don't understand. And you know, the interesting thing is, the question of why, when Job is asking that question, why me? What have I done? And the friends are quick to answer, well, you've obviously done something. When God answers, it's no longer a matter of why. That's an irrelevant question, but it's a matter of who. Who do you trust when the world crashes around you? So we've got a few things to learn from this story. Our why questions may not be answered, but we can know who we can trust. But first of all, bad things happen to good people. Don't just think that because something is happening, they obviously deserve it, because that's not true. It also tells us the story that not even the greatest wealth can keep us from trouble. It is not wealth that saves us, but it's God. And our why questions may never be answered, but we know that God is there to help us through our disasters. He is with us. He stays with us during those horrible times. And that is where our hope comes from.
We can have hope because our God has promised is our blessed assurance, and so undeserved we can have hope. Without faith in our Father, our God and Creator, we have hope. Because our God has promised, it's our blessed assurance, and so undeserved we can have hope. Without faith in our Father, our God and Creator, we have hope.